Did President Lincoln plunge us into a civil war needlessly? Are the roots of that conflict still with us today? And if so, should we split up the United States? We speak to Martin Armitage, co-author of the book Tyrant and a Top Hat, that proposes a libertarian fever dream that bases its premise on actions taken by Abraham Lincoln in 1861. I'm Doug Berger, and this is Secular Left. Welcome to this episode of the Secular Left podcast. I'm your host, Doug, and I want to introduce you to an author that I interviewed recently. His name is Martin Armitage, and he and his son Chris wrote a book about President Lincoln in the Civil War called Tyrant and a Top Hat. And I think it's a very interesting interview, something I don't normally interview people about, but I thought that the topic was very interesting. And after the interview, if you wish to hear my take on this book and their theory, check out, I attached an epilogue to this episode after the interview. Okay, our guest today is Martin Armitage. He, along with his son Chris, wrote a book called Tyrant and a Top Hat, and it takes a look at the issue of Lincoln and the Civil War. Thank you for joining us today, Martin.
Thanks for having me on. I'm honored to be asked to join you on this conversation.
And could you tell us a little bit about yourself, like a short bio, so we can get to know you?
Sure. Yes, I have a degree in history, an undergrad degree in history, master's degree in online education. I spent 16 years in various political positions, from elected official, appointed, paid positions. And I am just somebody who's been a history enthusiast my entire life. Just a little side note and unrelated to this podcast, I also am an outdoor enthusiast. In my later years, outdoors has pretty much become my expertise. And I have a podcast, if you don't mind me giving that a little plug.
Go ahead.
Papa Bear Hikes, which is available on all platforms.
All right. And your son, Chris, he is a veteran of the Air Force and Master of Science degree in Homeland Security. He was a former law enforcement officer. Is that correct?
Yes, he was in the security forces with the Air Force. He did 2 deployments as well as presidential duty detail while President Obama was in Argentina.
Okay. And he's also written some other books about human trafficking and about policing and things like that. So what is Tyrant and a Top Hat, briefly? What is your goal for this book?
Well, in a nutshell, what we're doing here is trying to get people to not sway their position, not say this is, I think there's a lot of books out there now that are trying to tell us this is how we should think. Instead, the goal here is to maybe get us to question, to get us to step back, maybe not necessarily read this and say, well, now I disagree with this or this has changed my mind, but maybe just get people to think something unique in this day and age. I think is provoking people to think and analyze what they believe. So what we're doing here is, examining, was war really the last resort for Lincoln, or were there other measures that possibly could have been taken to avoid a civil war? Not even, and not excluding letting the Union dissolve.
Okay. And then also later in the book, then you also propose some ideas about the current situation that we have and how to deal with that as well. Is that correct?
Yes, we get into, we examine, the historical nature of the cultural differences we have in our country, the geographical makeup of the country. You can take a map and a pencil and say, yeah, you go along here in the Southeast and you've got a group of people that believe this. And in the Northeast, you may have that. And in the Midwest, something their beliefs are unique to their lifestyles and what's important in their lives. And going as far back as when the country was even founded or before, those differences have always clashed. And 200 and some odd years later, are we looking to make a square peg fit in a round hole, possibly?
All right. And how did you get interested in this topic? What made you want to you and your son write this book?
Well, this goes back to when he was 16 years old, and we took a trip to Gettysburg with the Boy Scouts. And on the way home, I shared with him something that I had always thought about from the time I visited Gettysburg. And I grew up during the bicentennial. I was 11 years old, turning 12 in 1976. So history was a big part of our lives, anybody that grew up during that period.
Oh,
And
definitely, definitely.
yeah. And my family was really big on exposing us to history, which I'm very fortunate and grateful they did that. But I put it out there, being a pacifist, did we really need to go to war? And I always said, if we let the South just secede and go on their own way, they probably would have come running back anyway, right? If we had maybe approached it as a Cold War instead of fighting on a battlefield. Is it possible that if we had forged some trade agreements with other countries, other empires at that time, with European countries, could we have put the South in a position where, hey, we better make good with the North and maybe become a little bit more, be a little bit more willing to compromise on some of these ideas and take a look around the rest of the world and say, yeah, they're doing away with slavery. Maybe it's not, maybe it's time for us to do that.
Okay. And one of the things that is mentioned in the book is about Lincoln suspending habeas corpus. For the non-lawyers out there, could you explain what habeas corpus is and why it's important?
Well, habeas corpus, in a nutshell, and I'm not an attorney, so I'm going to give you a layman's and very layman's explanation to this. Yeah, that's the protection of our rights, our constitutional rights, such things such as free speech, for example, which is probably number one on that. The right to a speedy trial, protection from cruel and unusual punishment. And I'm sure I'm missing a lot of this. And like I said, it is a very layman's explanation to habeas corpus. Free press, all the things that were very important to our founding fathers. Some of the cornerstones of how this country was built.
Yeah, and for historical perspective, at least in this situation, was that habeas corpus was set aside in the early part of the Civil War to deal with Maryland. Maryland was a border state. They had Southern sympathizers, and in fact, a unit of the Army was attacked by some sympathizers, and that kind of what led Lincoln to deal with it in that way, and was Justice Taney, I forget how to pronounce his name,
Yeah.
had said that it was illegal because even in a war sense, you still have civil rights, or you should still have civil rights. And basically, Lincoln ignored his advice, and he was the district judge for that area. And I read further that he never even brought any of the cases up for hearings after this had all taken place, because he disagreed with it so much. How do you square that with the need for it was a national emergency, there was a rebellion going on, and he had to take these measures, and Congress was in recess? Does that play a part, or does that mitigate anything that he did at that time, early in the 1861?
Well, it's real easy for us 150 or 60 years later to say, yeah, this would have been an easier route to take. And I could certainly understand, all right, it was an emergency, something needed to be done very quickly. So yeah, I'm sitting here. Abraham Lincoln obviously didn't have the time that I have to sit around and think about this. So, and that's part of what we're trying to do with this book, is to get people to think a little bit. And the possibility could have been Maryland, just honoring the notion of states' rights and the sovereignty. You're with us, so we need you to exercise the laws that would protect people. Because let's face it, if you pick up arms, I guess up until what's his face took office, against the U.S. government or aggressive towards U.S. government, you broke the law. I know you committed an act of violence or an aggression, and it wouldn't matter if it was against the government or your neighbor, right? You would go to jail. If you took up a gun, went to your neighbor with a gun, you still broke the law. If you went to the Capitol building with guns and with the intention of overthrowing an election or a country, you still should go to jail. Could they have possibly been detained until they were brought to trial? Or I think that could have been an option, that anybody that was caught. And yet again, yes, hindsight, we didn't have the intelligence that we have now, the ability to gather intelligence. There was a lot of hearsay, hey, my neighbor Joe, I overheard him talking about that he was going to take his gun and go down to Fort Sumter next month, or go to go to Washington. We didn't have access to that kind of intelligence, but the possibility of maybe, detaining people who they knew were involved in the planning of the insurrection. Obviously somebody that committed an act, right? That's a no-brainer, right? They can be detained and dealt with through the courts.
Yeah, and to kind of put a modern context on that, when they had the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, a lot of times those people were arrested because they were breaking the law. They were detained, and then before they could be brought to trial, they were released because they knew that they had to bring them to trial and they probably would have got out anyway. So they released them. So that's generally how it's supposed to work.
Right.
And I know in Maryland, I guess they arrested 1/3 of the General Assembly and some newspaper editors and anybody that had said a nasty word about Lincoln. they just cast a wide net. And at the time, it seemed like something that they should do. And, hindsight, like you said, 100 years later, more than 100 years later, it's maybe that wasn't the best thing to try to do.
You and I have over 100 years of history here that we could talk about and point to examples. And some of them not that long ago, where we could say, hey, when a president gets out of control and feels he has that kind of power, right? There are people that were released that assaulted and even killed a police officer and, committed violent acts attacked our Capitol. Let's be honest here. That was a terrorist attack on January 6, 2021, or 2020. Was it 2021?
Yeah, it was 2021. Yeah,
2021. That was a terrorist attack. Okay,
right.
So our current president pardoned people who actually were involved in a terrorist attack.
Right.
Okay? And is there precedent for that? Well, yeah, sort of there is. And I think what we're looking to do here with that book is saying, well, were we setting some dangerous precedents back in 1860s with the Civil War? Did we now set some precedents that when maybe somebody with not so wholesome ideas or can maybe look back on that and say, well, Lincoln did it because he thought it was going to help the country. Well, I did it because we couldn't afford to let Joe Biden, this is going to happen if they take office. We're going to be done as a country, right? 4 years ago, right? We can't let that happen. Right. So you all got to go down here with your guns and your goofy costumes. And, I'm sorry I'm offending you. I'm guessing your politics are probably not going to be offended by this statement. But, you guys, your goofy costumes and your silly flags and go in and destroy the Capitol.
Moving on, though, to another point that make in the book was that, there was other alternatives to war. And one of them was that Congress could have just passed laws and outlawed slavery. And I just wanted to get your opinion, though, that there was at least two that were passed prior to the Civil War, the Slave Trade Acts of 1794 and 1800, and the Act of Prohibiting the Importation of Slaves that was signed by President Jefferson in 1808, which is kind of ironic because Jefferson was a slave owner. And he said, the spirit of master is abating, that of the slave rising from the dust, his condition mollifying, the way I hope, preparing under the auspices of heaven for total emancipation.
Now, I'll start with the Jefferson one. I mean,
sure.
And, like Jefferson's kind of a mixed bag historically. He owned slaves. Did Jefferson have something to gain by banning the importation of slaves? He probably did, because look, they were seen as a commodity. right? They were labor. So what would that do to the value of his slaves? And it's been said that he was financially struggling at the time. So, was there a little bit of a motivation here to increase his wealth? We don't know. But it didn't really have any teeth to it, because did it stop slavery? No, it just, at that point, um, there were enough slaves where if they just kept that institution going, they wouldn't need to import anymore. And what we were doing with the indigenous community, many of them were becoming enslaved as well. No, I mean, neither one of those acts, I think, had any teeth to them that were really going to do it. They were nothing more, I think, than compromises to appease the Southerners and maybe glad-head Northerners that were anti-slavery a bit. Um, my opinion, it should have just simply been, look, slavery is not recognized in this country as anymore. Okay, and if these states, the Southern states, felt that strongly about it and they seceded, well, look, the rest of these states that are abolishing slavery, move up here, move to the northern states. And again, I know I'm oversimplifying. I'm giving a very simple solution to something that was very complicated here. But I think that it would have really weakened it. Again, it would have been another instrument of weakening the South, the Southern culture of slavery and that institution.
For more information about any of the topics covered in this episode, check out our show notes at secularleft.us.
Yeah, and I know one of the examples that you used when you were talking about just passing laws and just getting rid of it was what happened with the UK and that they abolished slavery. But it took them at least 30 years to get to that point. They started like in 1803 and they didn't abolish it officially until 1833. And so,
look at this country. We abolished slavery supposedly with the Civil War. Then there's the passage of the 13th Amendment. And then how many decades later, we still have people, Rosa Parks is arrested for riding in the front of the bus.
It's about 100 years, right? It was
about
over 100
years
before
of
it was
battle.
enforced. Yeah.
And there are people today that can tell you, rightfully so, that fight is still going on. We're not calling it slavery, but that fight for equality is still taking place.
And then the other point, the other idea that you mentioned in the book was about, besides there being other alternatives, was that, Lincoln went with total war, destroyed crops, burnt cities, went whole, I think you used the term total war, which is a common term to use, where you put everything in. He got rid of commanders who didn't fight, like McClellan. And the thing, though, that I didn't see mentioned, though, well, you kind of mentioned it, was that, you mention it, but it kind of undercuts the argument, was that Lincoln did try to compromise with the Southern states, and they even offered to pay compensation, and the South rejected it. And the quote in your book, it says, the failure of compensated emancipation efforts reflected Southern intransigence. Even in those moments where Lincoln sought compromise, the South's reaction should have dispelled any illusions about the possibility of reconciliation. The Southern leadership made it clear that slavery was not up for negotiation, even when accompanied by financial compensation. This refusal exposed the depth of the South's commitment to preserving human bondage at all cost, prioritizing their preference for continued Black subjugation over economic incentives or peace. So how do you square that with your notion that Lincoln was a tyrant and didn't take these alternative measures? It looks like he did, and the South rejected them too. I mean, it was kind of both sides rejected compromises that were introduced.
Right. And tyrant, I think, is meant to just kind of be that, we live in a day and age, everything's clickbait, right? So It's like, all right, it's maybe, used in an exaggerated form, but in that sense, yes, Lincoln did try to compromise. There was no compromise there. Let's face it, right? It's To the south, there was no
To the
compromise.
south, right? It wasn't a compromise.
To the south, yeah, they didn't want to compromise. Lincoln should have maybe stepped back and said, and again, this is my opinion. I don't have the, yeah, I can't go back in time and change or pick anybody's brains, but look at the alternatives. I'm a pacifist. And that's kind of funny. Two of my kids were in the military, but I'm a pacifist. And I just really believe that wars can always be avoided, or 90% of the time they can be avoided. This was one that could have been. I think when the South rejected his proposal, that should have opened the door to say, okay, well, states who are anti-slave, hey, everybody's welcome to move here. And there is no returning. There's no, once they cross that line, they're free. There's no sending them back. They have, there's no extradition. They have total immunity from being sent back to the South. I think that would have weakened the South right there. And again, it's simplifying such a complicated topic, but I just think that, right there, that would have taken their legs out for them because they were so dependent on slave labor for their means of production, for their farming.
Okay. Well, that nicely segues into what we're going to talk about next is some of the ideas that you introduce in the last chapter, the 12th chapter, in your conclusion about how to deal with this, what did you call it, culturally fractured nation. I think that's the term that you used.
Yes.
So you're talking about dividing the United States up into regions that are culturally the same, and that people that don't fit in then would move to where they would fit in. But to me, that doesn't seem at all practical. I mean, who's going to pay to move these people? Because they're located, they may or may not have jobs, but they have familiar ties, and it's not like you can just get up like back in the 1860s. You just can't get up and move. You know what I'm saying today?
Mm-hmm.
So how would you work through that? Is there a process that you've thought about, or?
Yeah, that's, I think, just like again, I keep using the same phrase, very simple way of looking at it. But if there's certain things that are very important to you, like teaching history out of a Bible, is that important to you, and you live in California or New York or Vermont, maybe what you need to do is consider moving to one of those states where your kids can be taught history out of a Bible. If you live in Alabama and you want your children to learn history, actual history, maybe you move them to a state where they're teaching history. And yeah, not an easy thing to do. It costs a lot of money. I just moved from New York down to Florida. I know how difficult that is. And I'm self-employed, but somebody who has a job, it becomes even more complicated. The idea of getting up and moving. But, that's not something that would happen overnight. It would, that would take time. That would, you first would have to see a situation where you would have to start to see some successful secession movements. And, and unfortunately, world history has shown us that when you have these type of movements, these secession movements, where a group breaks off from a country, you have refugee crisis. Does it create a refugee crisis in this country? Well, probably not. I think probably what it creates is, it really sucks living here. It sucks living in California surrounded by liberals who make me recognize that there's people out there that look and act different than I do. It sucks. But one day I'll get to go move somewhere where, everybody is white, Christian, and the males dominate.
But the other thing I wanted to ask you too about that is that you, on one hand, you talk about separating culturally fractured nation into separate regions, and then you talk about an overarching protection of rights. And I don't see also how that works either. I don't see how you could, I don't know, let's call it the Ohio region, and they believe a certain way, and they make laws just based on that. How does that mean that somebody like me could have my civil rights enforced that are guaranteed by the Bill of Rights if we're all fractured?
Well,
I mean, how would
that's a
that
great
work?
question. That's a good question. First of all, the fracturing wouldn't be structured. It would have to happen in a very organic way, right? It couldn't be forced. It couldn't be like Congress would sit down with a map and draw lines. That would not work. Okay. I think if it were going to happen, you would see maybe you know maybe President Musk says, okay, we're not going to give any aid to New York. So the governor of New York gets pissed off and says, well, you know what? We're going to secede from the United States. We're going to be a sovereign nation and not be a part of the United States. And then you start to see the smaller states, maybe New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and it spreads up into New England. I think it would work that way. Maybe the southern states and say, hey, you know what? They can govern the way they want to. So you would end up with these, and again, this is my vision. You'd see these regions fracturing off and forming their own governments. But then what you'd have, you would need some sort of protection because then these regions become very vulnerable to outside forces. So what I'd see is something maybe that reflects what the European Union possibly is, where you don't necessarily have a central government that is passing laws, but maybe just being able to oversee commerce, trade, and military security.
Well, we have kind of a microcosm of what you described there about having separate sections and overarching look. Is here in the state of Ohio where I live, we have what's called home rule. And the cities and municipalities in the state are granted limited ability to govern themselves how they see fit. So if they want a separate tax to pay for schools, they can do it. In the past, it's been they've outlawed plastic bags, single-use plastic bags, or usually it's quality of life thing. Well, some conservatives in the state government in Columbus didn't appreciate that, and they ended up passing laws that prohibited states from making those kinds of laws. And so it's kind of sort of describing what you're talking about with the federal government and these different areas that you think are going to come around, is that the national government is passing these laws that the states don't like. They should be allowed to govern themselves. Am I pretty much in the ballpark?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. And then you talked about having, basically, to me, what it looks like is that depending on where you live, you would enjoy certain rights and privileges that you wouldn't get in certain other areas that you live. But the national government would guarantee a certain level of rights that everybody would enjoy. Is that correct? Or
I don't know that they would be able to guarantee rights. I mean, I would see a national government that would be more focused on just, like I said, commerce, trade, and security. But I don't think we should have a national government that nullifies gay marriage. If you're in a state where gay marriage was legalized 20 years ago, and now the federal government's saying, well, we're not, we're doing away with it. It no longer exists. Right now we're in a situation, and we're going to start seeing it in this country. Anybody that doesn't believe it's happening, we're dealing with a very heavy-handed executive branch of this government like maybe we have never seen ever in the history of this country. And that's why
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but how would you think that a national government couldn't pass a law outlawing same-sex marriage again?
Because they would have limited
work?
powers. They'd have limited powers. They can't, they're not involved in things like civil rights, for example. Right?
So
states
then,
would have their own, those new nations, I guess we'll call them, regions, would have their own constitution.
So what do we do with the Bill of Rights then that's in our Constitution?
Well, we would no longer be the United States, first of all. We would be the country formerly known as the United States. And then we would have, 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 we would Yeah, and we would be a collection of maybe 4 or 5, possibly 6 states within what was formerly the United States. The United States would then just become, as I said, this body that oversees commerce, trade, and national defense, and not continental defense.
Mhm.
Sort of what, maybe even more in line with what the European, having it evolve into closer to maybe what the European Union is trying to achieve.
All right. Well, in quoting from the book here, you talk about, it says proponents of controlled separation respond that certain legal instruments could preserve a universal safeguard of civil liberties. As in the European Union, individual rights might be enforced through overarching frameworks, charters of essential freedoms, or constitutional clauses that no state or region may uh, derogate. I think that's how to pronounce that. But you're saying the Bill of Rights wouldn't be that document. We would have to have something different.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm not a doomer and gloomer, but I have to feel at this point we are moving closer to being the country formerly known as the United States. And that document that we have, the Bill of Rights, um, we may be reaching a point where if the country were to fracture, where if we were to break up, there would be, we really wouldn't need it, right? If there's, you have 4, 5, 6 different nations forming within is what now the United States, those 4 or 5 nations, whatever, would be writing their own Bill of Rights or their own constitutions. And, for better or for worse, and in some places for worse, um, some of the rights we're enjoying right now, currently, will be gone. Uh, but they're not being, right now on the other side of that coin, they're threatening to be taken away from, people who have fought decades or over a century, rights they have fought to achieve, women, people of color, LGBT plus community, what they have fought for decades. We're watching rights being taken away from them.
Yeah. Well, like we know, if you study history, I believe you've studied history, just like I've studied history, and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was all about protecting property, protecting uh, wealthy people's property. And it used to be that a citizen was a white man who owned property, and nobody else was considered a citizen. Nobody else could vote. And that's changed as we've moved along in history. But that was the intention. And so I totally agree with your premise about the fractured nation, and that we have these different competing looks and ideas and values. I get that. I do know that we've had many polls, newspaper and other kind of polls that show that a majority of Americans today approve of a progressive, supporting government that protects the rights and makes sure people are fed and and help with housing and take care, make sure that nobody falls off on the wayside. And so I'm not sure that leaving all that up to individual states is really workable. For example, the abortion question was given back to the states, and we just see a mishmash of different things. But I am the idea that we're human, we live in this country, we all have the same exact rights, and nobody should be able to take them away. They're not debatable. Abortion rights are not debatable. Same sex marriage is not debatable. Unless you're causing harm to people, the government should just stay out of your business completely. And
I agree with you 100% on all of that. Yeah.
right. And so that's why I really don't I really don't subscribe to your conclusions in this book. You bring up some valid points. I really enjoy it. It was a good read. It made me think, which I think is important. But the conclusion I just didn't agree with. So what I will do is, as we wrap up today, is I'll leave you have the last word. You want to get people to read your book, what's the takeaway?
Well,
Is there something that we didn't discuss that you think is important? Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you for reading the book and thank you for thinking. Okay. You don't agree with the conclusion, but it made you think. And that's important. Okay. Because when we're thinking, what we're doing is we're looking for answers. The answer might not be, probably isn't in that book. Okay. But we start thinking about it. Okay. And how do we protect these important rights that we all have? You mentioned rights that are so important. People fought for decades, in some cases, centuries. We don't know if our founding fathers, how they would have felt about healthcare. Something tells me that in 1776, if they knew that our health system was going to look like it does today, if they knew we were going to have the advancements we have in healthcare today, there may have been something in that Bill of Rights regarding healthcare and public education and addressing civil rights much more than just white men that own property, as you said, right? Because it wasn't just all white men. I grew up in New Jersey. Our county representatives were called freeholders. They were freeholders because they were people that owned their land outright, and that qualified them to hold office and vote. So please read the book. Don't have to agree with me. Don't hate us for what we say. Just put it down at the end and say, all right, let me think about this stuff. Because as I said, when we're thinking, we're looking at options and we're looking for answers when we're talking as adults and not just fighting with each other, because there's just too much of team politics going on to ever resolve anything. We get rid of this bullshit team politics. We might actually start finding some answers. The days where Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives can sit down and find a middle ground, they just seem to be lost now. And we're in trouble. I'm not going to use the word doom, but we are in trouble as a nation if we can't get ourselves back to that point where we could peacefully disagree, where two people can sit down and have a political debate, disagree, even let it get heated, and then when it's over, we can laugh and sit down and have a cup of coffee or a beer, and our lives go on.
All right, Martin, again, thank you very much. And let Chris know, I appreciate that you guys wrote this book and took a chance and was discussing a point that probably most people don't even realize is a valid point. And good luck on your future endeavors.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me on.
And again, I wanted to thank Martin Armitage and his son Chris for giving me the opportunity to interview them about this book. As you heard in the interview, at the end of the interview, I said that I did not buy the conclusion of the book. The reason why I don't is because and as I said in the blurb at the beginning of the episode, the opening blurb during the theme music, it's a libertarian fever dream. They have this idea that they could have a decentralized government that would only be tasked with trade, foreign relations, and military security. And that's it. Everything else would be left up to the states or the individual zones or areas or whatever their particular idea is about this that's in this book. And that I just don't think that that's a practical solution. Just to give you some example is that we had a decentralized government prior to the United States Constitution being adopted. It was the Articles of Confederation. And basically the central government had literally no power to do anything other than trade, foreign relations, and the military. And they elected the white landholders that controlled the elections, and the government at the time elected to change it. And you can read the arguments for it in the Federalist Papers. And I really think that a stronger central government, kind of what we currently have, that protects a set of civil rights for everyone, no matter where you live, no matter what your socioeconomic status is, you're a citizen, you get these rights. You're a human, you have basic humanity, and the government protects you. I'm just one of those people that do not believe that rights can just be voted away, or that politicians can pass a law and exclude a certain group of people, like what we see the attacks on the trans community currently going on by Christian nationalists. And it's only the libertarians that have these ideas. Now, I'm not saying that Martin Armitage and his son are libertarians. I'm just saying that they're advancing a typical libertarian idea that we have a decentralized national government, and then we'd have these little zones that people could live in wherever they felt like they fit in. The other thing that I don't agree with either was this notion that we are a fractured society. Yes, there's polarization, there's political polarization, and yes, in the current political situation right now, it sucks for a lot of people in marginalized communities. But it's not I don't think it's a systemic issue. What it is, if you want to call it systemic, is that there's some people that just don't care enough to vote. That's one thing. They don't care enough to stay in the loop and hold their elected officials accountable. And when you have enough people that do that, who just don't care, don't vote, and don't thing, and they're like, oh, I don't want to, politics is so messy, I don't like it. When you have enough people that do that, then you have these little pipsquirts like Trump and Musk come in and screw everything up. And that's exactly what we have. When you don't vote because of some issue, some single issue that is very important to you, and you don't take the long-term approach and look at it from a long-term situation. These conservatives that are currently running roughshod through the country, they've been planning this for decades. They've been planning to do this for decades. They've been planning to do it since at least the 1970s. And Paul Reinrich, look up his name. I'll throw a link about this guy. And they've taken the courts. They've gotten these extremist politicians in office. They got Trump elected again. Project 2025 is chock full of everything that they plan on doing. And that is because the conservatives have all this money, these billions of dollars behind them, and they've basically put everybody else to sleep, and then they come strolling on in and have their way with us. That is what I think is the problem. I don't have a problem with Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. He didn't start the war. He decided that he was going to use whatever means necessary to preserve the Union. And that's what he did. That is what a leader does. He believed he had a constitutional duty to do it. Did he overstep his bounds on occasion? Yes. When you talk about rebellion and a civil war, sometimes the people in power overstep their bounds. And like I was talking with Martin during the interview, that, when we had the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, a lot of people got arrested. And luckily our legal system was such that then they were released. And basically the whole point was to get them off the street. It wasn't to put them in prison. Now we have some people, wannabe dictators, that would like to put people in jail for a long time. Now that would be undemocratic. But again, if you break the law, whatever law it is, then you should be willing to face the consequences, whatever that is. Even if it means certain death or whatever. And I'm not saying that means that the law is good. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that you just can't ignore a law because you don't agree with it. And so I think President Lincoln did what he needed to do to preserve the Union. The South is the one that attacked Fort Sumter first. They started the shooting war. And as I pointed out even in their book, they note that the South, that Lincoln tried to compromise with the South, and the South rejected it because they believed slavery was the only thing that they had going for them. And they were never going to give it up. They were never going to give it up without a fight, put it that way. And I think Lincoln knew that. And that's not why he fought the Civil War. He didn't fight the Civil War to free the slaves. He fought the Civil War to preserve the Union. And that is the job that he accomplished. And then towards late in the war, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So if you were asking me if I'm going to recommend this book, I don't recommend the book only because I don't agree with it, but it's open to you. I mean, like I said, it has some good ideas, to read. They did their work, their research. I just don't agree with their premise or their conclusion. And that's what I think about that book. But again, I appreciate Martin and his son for giving me the opportunity to have them on and discuss the book. Thank you for listening to this episode. You can check out more information, including links to sources used, in our show notes on our website at secularleft.us. Secular Left is hosted, written, and produced by Doug Berger, and he is solely responsible for the content. Send us your comments, either using the contact form on the website or by sending us a note at comments@secularleft.us. Our theme music is Dank and Nasty, composed using Amplify Studio. See you next time.